morning we had Martin Lakos from Macquarie Bank give an absolute compelling overview of the global, Australian and Queensland economies. And I think the important takeouts for us on that is that things are on the improve. Consumer confidence is improving, and that's going to be on the back of interest rate cuts, tax cuts and the like. We've still got strong population growth, which is having a big impact on the supply-demand imbalance of housing, not only in Queensland but across Australia in general. What that means for us is that we'll see continued housing price growth in both housing prices and rents.
So my presentation is titled Known Unknowns, and we think that's very appropriate given what's going on, certainly more recently coming out of since the inauguration of President Trump and the policies that he articulated right through the whole election campaign, and how he's now transacting or putting those policies in place. Obviously that's causing disruption, that's causing uncertainty at this point in time. But I think it's worth just having a quick look back to where we've come from in 2024 before we start looking at 2025. And 2024 was a positive surprise. Global growth held up very well around trend. The best economy of the developed world was in fact the US economy, running well above trend. And although President Trump has been talking about that he inherited a terrible economy, that's actually not true from an economic growth perspective. The US economy is actually in good shape, and we want that to be the case. What we did find in 2024, however, that the EU went through a very shallow recession, and China is not growing to its optimum level, which is normally around 7%, currently growing a touch below 5%. And what we are expecting to see in 2025 is more stimulation coming out of the Chinese authorities, because so far the recovery has been quite tepid. And from an Australian perspective, we want China to do well economically, because obviously we coattail them in terms of our big exports in iron ore and energy, for example. So what about 2025 with all these things going on, given the global economy is actually doing okay? Well, inflation looks like it's being tamed, and that's clearly good news. We're starting to find that central banks are starting to cut rates, probably not as early as, and certainly not in the quantum that a lot of people would have liked or would have hoped. But we are seeing a change in the cycle, and that should have a more positive outlook in regards to business and consumer confidence around the world. Here in Australia, we've only found the Reserve Bank cut rates in February. There was expectations of a number of cuts last year in 2024. But we are expecting to see the Reserve Bank to continue to do some additional cuts, but probably not as many as a lot of people would like to think. Currently, given the sticky situation in inflation, or inflation is sticky, particularly where we've seen wages growth and higher rents, we're only expecting 2 more rate cuts this year from the Reserve Bank, possibly in May, subject to the election, and then again in August. Again, the Reserve Bank wants to make sure that inflation doesn't start picking up by being overstimulated by lower interest rates. But lower rates are certainly going to help households, and there's absolutely no doubt also we've gone through an 18-month wages growth cycle. So we've seen a pickup in household income, and that's alleviating some of those pressures on cost of living for households as well. So we are expecting also to see a pickup in household activity, and that's really important for the Australian economy. It's about well over half of our economic activity from households alone. So there's some of the key elements that we think is really, really important. From a business perspective, quite surprisingly, one of the elements of supporting Australia's economic growth has been business investment. Although it's starting to decline, it hasn't gone negative. And that sort of ties into where business confidence has been. And the surveys are certainly showing that business confidence has gone negative, but it hasn't collapsed, unlike household confidence collapsed through 23 and 24. So what does that mean going forward? Well, we are expecting to see the Australian economy pick up somewhat from where we are now. We do think that the December quarter was probably the trough or the low of our economic activity. We've declined from 3% growth down to about 0.8 of 1% growth. And so we are expecting a reasonable recovery towards the end of this year, with us growing around 1.8%. But not quite back to where we were at 3%. That's going to take a little bit longer. There's a couple of obviously impediments that tends to see activity slow down. We need to get the election out of the way in Australia. Typically households and businesses sit on their hands before an election waiting for a result. Clearly, we've got all these unknowns taking place coming out of the policies from the United States, and obviously this tariff regime is going to impact some industries here in Australia as well. So there's a lot of those areas that remain unknown. But overall, we think the underlying momentum is okay, and we're expecting to see the Australian economy pick up, as I said, towards the end of this year. Into 2026, well, that's a slightly different story. By then, hopefully, we've had 3 interest rate cuts here in Australia. Inflation well and truly in the range by which the Reserve Bank wants to keep inflation, and we should start seeing an improving confidence in regards to the household activity and business activity. Lastly, obviously, we can't forget housing, and we can't forget, obviously, commercial property and infrastructure as well. And so with a very strong population growth, clearly there's been an ongoing or pickup in demand for housing. And in particular, the flow-on effect for that is obviously a pickup in demand for infrastructure and commercial as well. Particularly the commercial side seems to be well and truly focused on things like distribution centres and data centres, and we think that's going to be a continuing theme going into this year. With lower interest rates, not only are we going to see a pickup in activity in housing construction, but also in commercial construction. And it does appear to us from an international perspective that the cost of construction is just starting to come down. It certainly looks like it's peaked as well. So a couple of more positive things in the building space going forward for Australia in 2026.